Um, I just wanted to say that maybe some of you know my work, but just in case you don't, then I need to say sort of first up that of course I'm passionate about normal physiological childbirth. Um, I guess I need to declare I'm a home birth mum myself, and my grandchildren have all been born at home, so that's sort of my bias. And I think then, because of what's happening in the birth culture, this question of educating for choice or compliance, um, becomes really a serious topic. But my bias really is about normal physiological childbirth. So you'll see that a little bit also in terms of the things that I want to talk through with you. And I'll be interested in answering questions later on. So I've been around the birth scene for nearly 40 years and seen lots of trends come and go. But one of the things that's so exciting at the moment with relationship to this particular topic is the huge interest now in human rights in childbirth, which is really starting to change the flavour of some of these issues, which is a brilliant thing. So we're going to go through on a PowerPoint to keep me on track, but also I'll be talking to it. So let's go. So first of all, just to have a little look here, I'm not going to go through all these things, but as I'm speaking to you, really physiologically normal birth, normal physiological childbirth sort of requires all of these things, but is particularly, and we know much more about this now as well since Dr. Sarah Buckley's brilliant work and others, but about the hormones and oxytocin, endorphins. We know also that, midwifery primary care, midwifery continuity models, doulas, of course, that idea of working with pain, being in water, all of these things, and some of which I'll be addressing as we go through the talk in a bit more detail. But these are the things that we know really are best for normal physiological childbirth. So keeping that in mind, this is what we would love to see more of. But however, what we actually see is in present time in our birth culture, this what I call really socially normal birth, which is really almost the opposite of, run by fear rather than by love and trust, as in oxytocin. So really it's much more about adrenaline driving the show, the routine interventions, the cascade of interventions, the birth space, all of these things that we know that can lead much more down that track to those intervention pathways. So there's this discrepancy about normal physiological childbirth and what really serves normal physiological childbirth, but then really what's happening in terms of what we might call socially normal birth. And I'll back this up in a moment by just going through some of the stats, the most current stats for Australia, just to get this sort of picture about what it means then as a childbirth educator to be educating to enable women to make good choices towards, in particular, normal birth, as opposed to whether we're sort of just teaching for compliance, because compliance would be to end up being part of the stats that really point this picture about socially normal birth. So in my reckoning, in the stats, in fact, they don't talk about normal physiological childbirth. You have to sort of tease it out. And in the teasing out that I've done, as well as talking to lots of midwives and even obstetricians now and asking, in their hospital settings, how much normal physiological childbirth happens, they usually want to barter with me a bit. And I say, no, just starting with the hormones, through with the hormones, baby born, through the hormones. And the most we get is about 1 to 5%. So I want to just talk to you about a few other of the stats that I think are very pertinent here. One is, and this one I frame from the point of view of looking at, given that we know that the hormones are so important for that ongoing situation of not only facilitating the birth, then facilitating the loving and the bonding between the mum and the baby, or the dad and the baby and the people around the baby as it's born. The hormones are so important, that flow on then for breastfeeding and the importance of breastfeeding in terms of health and well-being. All of that flow on, that normal physiological childbirth and the hormonal cocktail doing its magic work. Just to put that in the frame, so the latest figures for Australia, that dance between the mother and the baby starting through the hormones, only 53% of babies really get to call the shots about when they're ready and starting that hormonal dance with their mum. Only 53%, very frightening. And then a third of those those mums and babies, even though the labour has started spontaneously, a third of them are going to go on to be augmented with synthetic hormone. So that's really messing with the, it's not a great picture for that full expression of the hormones between the mother and the baby. The induction rate is 28% in Australia. World Health Organization suggests that only 10% across the world for true medical need. We also have the 20% of elective cesareans where there's no hormones involved at all. So you can see that impact on optimal hormonal flow starts already right from the onset of labour or no labour at all. We then have the method of birth. So this is the vaginal birth figure, which doesn't mean to say that this is normal physiological childbirth, but the vaginal birth figure is only 67%. The Caesar rate is 33% across the board. Medical pain relief, 77% of women who labour will use medical pain relief. And in first labours, it's 87% of women will use medical pain relief. And we know that that medical pain relief can be the start of that cascade of intervention. So that's feeding into that aspect of the discrepancy between normal physiological childbirth and socially normal birth. And then, of course, we have 95 to 99% of births where that final third stage is that big burst of hormones should come through to boost the mother and the baby and that love bond right at the time of birth. That managed third stage with that injection of oxytocin at that point, which cuts across those magic moments. So these are some of the stats. I want to also just add some other ones, which is a breakdown of some of these stats in regard to the first birth. Because across the world and in Australia too, this idea of keeping the first birth normal has become quite a big catch cry, if you like, to trying to address this high rate of interventions and to boost the capacity for normal birth. Just recently in the Capes conference in Brisbane, Professor Hannah Dahlen talked about this, and she gave these stats for first births. So she said that in first births, and in particular with low-risk women, they had a 36% of inductions. So again, that's those hormones synthetic hormones coming through. For the method of birth, then unassisted vaginal birth, which again, remember, is not equating to normal physiological childbirth. Unassisted vaginal birth is 47% for first babies, only 47%. The assisted vaginal birth rate, so that's forceps or vacuums, is 25% for first births. The episiotomy rate is 18% for first births, and the caesarean rate for first births is 27%. So you can see that in those first births, those figures are higher than for subsequent births. Another aspect that came out of that conference, which was quite a sort of a calling cry for us in Australia, it was a study that was looking at the VBAC rates around the world, the OptiBirth trial. And in Ireland, Germany, and Italy, they had rates of VBAC at running between 29 to 36%. In the Netherlands, Sweden, and Finland, they had VBAC rates of 45 to 55%. And in Australia, we have a VBAC rate of 13%. So I'm sort of trying to paint the picture here in terms of why this idea of are we educating for choice or compliance is so important when we think about these stats. The science is saying, just to step back here, so you'll see this slide come up quite a bit. We're thinking about ourselves as educators. Do women know this? Do they know about those stats? Do they know, in my language, that pretty much the birth culture as it's unfolding at the moment is pretty well stacked against them in terms of that normal physiological childbirth? So do they know it? And if they don't, who's going to tell them? So keep this in mind all the way through this talk. So with normal birth, we know that the science is sort of catching up with what lots of us old hippies who, or me, I should say, 40 years ago, coming into the birth scene, the things that we knew were important in terms of that birthplace of women feeling safe, feeling familiar, feeling, that they're going to be the ones to greet their babies and so on and so on. The science is now backing that in terms of, what we're knowing now about the microbiome, the concerns now about the epigenetics and the unfolding of what's happening through the generational line with these interfered with births that we're dealing with. The hormones, of course, we didn't fully know scientifically, but we knew something about that love bond, and so that's being reinforced by what we're knowing now about the huge benefits of normal physiological childbirth, and as well that sort of idea of safety, security, and the satisfaction in women that moving through those birth experiences and feeling that their own strength and empowerment in that situation. So we would think and we would hope that our birthplace, the culture, is around supporting normal physiological childbirth. But in fact, it's not the case. Really, the default in our birth culture is much more around that socially normal birth. So in my book, I talk about this quite a bit in terms of talking about the pathways to intervention. Of course, we're privileged to be in a country like Australia where when women have a true medical need for those interventions, they generally have access to them. How wonderful. As opposed to many women across the world who desperately need those interventions but don't have, because of the health dollar and so on in their countries, they don't have access to those interventions. So none of us are quibbling about interventions per se, how brilliant, when they're needed. But certainly with the stats the way they are, you would think that they're not all needed in our situation here. So do women know this? Who's going to tell them how to tease that out? Childbirth educators, of course. So I want to talk a little bit about just a few papers that have come out just recently around this idea about what I call the circumstantial pathway and the nudge birthing pathway, which is really about the circumstances about what's happening in the hospital rather than the mother's circumstance. So the true medical need would be about the mother and baby's circumstance, but really so many of the interventions are happening because of the circumstances of the place that she's giving birth. So just recently, there've been quite a lot of stuff coming out of America. In particular, the United States, the obs and gynos over there have come out so dramatically. We're so thrilled to say that so many of the things that have become standard protocol are really not necessary and are leading more to these interventions. And there's one obstetrician over there, beautiful obstetrician, who is also put out a paper just recently, which you can find on my Facebook page actually, talking about the design of the birth space as well as other aspects. So Dr. Neil Shah, and he says, I'm just reading a few quotes from this article, the decision to perform a C-section is usually confirmed by the outcome. A healthy baby delivered through a C-section is proof that the surgery was successful, or a suffering baby is proof that it was needed. So the criteria has shifted quite dramatically. And he goes on to say that the hospital a woman chooses is a major risk factor for her having this major surgery, these Caesars. Really depends on which hospital the woman ends up in, not so much about her and her own medical situation. So then he goes on to say, uncovering the cause of the rising C-section rate. Number one, he says, is the economic incentives. For instance, in the hospitals and clinics and many of the obstetricians get paid more for doing cesareans. So this is a big factor. Do women know this? The time, there's a matter of time. So he's saying that the average vaginal delivery requires about 20 hours of medical attention, whereas it's compared to just 2 hours for the typical C-section. And with that pressure in hospitals to move women through the sort of whole system faster, we can see that that really is a nudge and part of the circumstances of what's going on in the hospital. And we might add to that in Australia, because I know that these things are the case in Australia, that baby boom that's happening, that's pushing that as well. The other thing he's saying is that the labour ward is designed for surgery. A woman in a labour ward who's is involved with all those interventions, it looks much more like a cardiac ICU, he suggests, rather than a labouring space. So we know this to be the case in Australia as well. That information in America that's come out has been picked up by a number of the big childbirth education websites and organisations, and one being in particular the Childbirth Connection, I've got details of this at the end of the talk. So they're saying new professional recommendations to limit labour and birth interventions. What pregnant women need to know. I'll go through one or two, but one of the points they make is, unfortunately, it often takes many years before healthcare providers reliably carry out the recommendations of professional organisations. So it is important for pregnant women themselves to become informed and to take an active role in securing high quality care for themselves and their babies. And do they know this? And if not, who can educate them? Educate them about staying at home until active labour. And there's now this conversation about that active, we wouldn't think about women being in active labour until they're around about 6 centimetres dilated. So staying at home, keeping track of the baby's heartbeat by the sonicate or intermittent handheld devices, not using, I repeat, not using continuous fetal monitoring, which really has a very bad press in terms of it doesn't provide any greater guarantee about mum and baby being safer. But really what it does do is pretty well predict that can be start of that cascade of interventions and lead to more seizures and so on. So the obs and gynos themselves in America are saying that women shouldn't be on routine continuous monitoring. Bravo. They should obtain continuous one-on-one support. We've known this for so long, both in terms of midwifery, in terms of the doula studies and so on. So they're saying that this not only improves the normal birth outcome, but also the satisfaction that women feel in their childbirth. Here. But they should, of course, be drinking liquids and eating during the labour. They should avoid artificial rupture of the membranes. Yes, of course. They should be upright and moving about in labour, of course. They should be working with pain. They should be supported to work with pain to avoid the pain relief, the medical pain relief, which we know can be that start of that cascade of interventions. Using active positions and following their own urges for pushing and giving birth. They should be using their own urges and in preference their own positions. They also delayed cord clamping, immediate skin to skin, and early and continued breastfeeding. So this is coming out from the obstetric obs and gynos and being picked up and disseminated by the big groups in America that relate to the trying to disseminate this information. As in Australia, we would want to be as well. They've made a little footnote which says that while the recommendations mention receiving support from a friend or family member, the systematic review cited found that the support from someone in the woman's social network increased her satisfaction, but did not reduce her likelihood of a caesarean birth. So that's it's a crucial point. I talk about it much more when I'm talking about supporting women for working with pain rather than sometimes family and friends and or partners can get caught in a sympathy loop, which means that the medical pain relief comes in and that leads that down to that cascade of intervention. So it's important to note that it's not just about any support, it's about particular experience support. Just as I'm going on, coming out of the Cochrane review and also from England, we go back here to GBS screening, which we know happens in the pregnancy, but of course can lead to problems in terms of timing protocols or antibiotics and what have you, and so on in the birth. And the review of that comes out with saying that systematic population screening programs are not recommended for GBS. We know that here in Melbourne, some hospitals do, some hospitals don't. Do women know this? Do they know they have a choice? Do they know that the hospital around the corner is not doing this, whereas the hospital that they might have ended up in does do this? So all this information, the Cochrane database coming out about the intermittent listening to the baby's heartbeat rather than continuous fetal monitoring, so important in terms of keeping birth normal. But these are all part of the things that, if we're thinking about ourselves as childbirth educators, are we educating for choice, i.e. women making choices that would protect and boost their capacity for normal birth? Or are we teaching for compliance about what happens about these routine protocols in the birth settings that you may be educating for, that women are attending? So this is a little bit of the information that I've just shared about about the reasons why, depending on the hospital that the woman goes to, that I've mentioned. Also, at the Capers conference last week, darling, Professor Hannah Darlin was talking about this, keeping the first birth normal, and she listed all of this research. And I'm not medically or academically minded, but this level one quality of research, this is top level research. Level 2, level 3, level 4, good solid research, but not at that top level. But you can see so much of the things that I'm mentioning here. Not, of course, also water immersion in birth for labour and birth, level 1 research saying yes, so on. So as you're reading through that, I'm just backing myself in terms of the things that I'm saying here. Do women know these things? They need to know these things so that they can make choices in their best interests. Do women know this? And that means then who, if they don't, who will be telling them? So within all of that, some of the choices that they need to make, given that we know normal physiological childbirth is helpful for their health and for their babies, particularly in low-risk women, which is most of the population. So as childbirth educators, we would be encouraging them about who their caregivers would be, about issues about the birth space that they're choosing to birth in, and also aspects about the type of childbirth education that they'll be engaging in. So I want to unpack this a little bit now. So we know that the research really around the world is that midwifery continuity of care, sort of primary midwifery care and midwifery continuity of care, is best for normal physiological childbirth. It's best for women's satisfaction and emotional well-being after their birth. In Australia, the latest figures are that only 8% of women in Australia are involved in continuity of care. I'm sure this does not relate to the number of women who would love to be involved with continuity of care. There are many women who want that form of care, but the programs are not there to meet the need. So continuity of care would be really gold standard in terms of there's lots of research about this, certainly much higher for normal birth, lowers the rates of prem babies, and also the emotional and psychological outcomes, even in situations where the birth hasn't gone so straightforwardly and that those interventions have been needed. The emotional satisfaction and the mother's psychological outcome is much improved in terms of continuity of care. In Melbourne, we have a number of continuity of care programs at the Women's, the Cosmos program, at the Mercy, a few others, Sunshine, Casey, and a few others I know are coming on board. I think Box Hill, I think even now Ferntree Gully. Again, small programs, but hopefully with lots of women power, they'll be expanded. Birth support. So this comes back. So the Cochrane Review talks about that continuity of support from a person who is present solely to provide support, is not a member of the women's social network, as I talked about a moment ago, is experienced in providing labour support and has at least a modest amount of training, appears to be most beneficial. So combined with that continuity of care with the midwife, and then also that continuous support from, which may be the midwife who can provide it, but sometimes they're unable to, and having that other experienced support in there is most beneficial for normal physiological childbirth, and all those other benefits in terms of the emotional outcome, psychological outcome for the mother. The birth space. So the birth space becomes very important when we understand what is needed for the hormones. So when we understand that the oxytocin, which both Sarah Buckley talks about as the shy hormone, as well as NMA, shy hormone, it's it's a robust hormone when it's running strongly, but is very shy, and so that the space that women give birth in is very important. There's some Australian midwifery research that talks not only about the hormones but about the birth space, who've captured this sort of phrase about are women birthing in a sanctum or in a surveillance room. And then in the sanctum, it's support a space that's supportive of the hormonal and physical work of the labour, as well as the sanctum is really entirely women-centred, so that, if you like, the power hierarchies in the birth space are centred around the mother rather than in the opposite, which would be a surveillance room. In fact, often the mother is at the bottom of that hierarchy of the medical caregivers, the obstetric teams, and so on down the hierarchy, as we know is the case in most hospitals. But a sanctum would turn that on its head and have the mother be the centre of that power base in that space, and that she's calling the shots and following her own feelings and needs, and that the people around and the power in the space serves her and her baby, rather than her feeling that she has to attend to what is being asked of her by those in the sort of power hierarchy. This is a feminist issue as well, which is another part of the big discourse that's happening around the things that are shaking up birth at the moment. So that sanctum, or is the birth space a surveillance room, which is at the service of that sort of hierarchy of power, that medical power, with the mother and the baby really being at the bottom of that power, and that the surveillance room, in a way, this is I think there's a very sad confluence here of this idea of safety in birth. So we know that from the hormones that if we're talking about and that we're wanting to provide safety in the birth space, this is really about the mother feeling the territory is safe for her and that she feels emotionally safe. And if that's right, then her hormones generally will be flowing beautifully for the birth to go straightforwardly. But in this medicalized birth culture, we've really brought that all down to medical safety. And in order to ensure medical safety, we're using medical surveillance of the mother and baby in order to ensure supposedly that medical safety. But by doing that, we're really cutting through and undermining the feeling of emotional and territorial safety. So it's sort of a standoff, which then means that the births don't go well, and as you all know, that cascade of interventions really can get going. So a birth space which is a sanctum, or the surveillance room. So of course, home birth for couples having their births at home, this is a sanctum, their own sanctum, and we see that the power balance in there is that the mother, certainly in her own home, is making those choices and being nurtured and cared for according to her particular needs. And of course, the research around the world says that for low risk women, healthy women, home birth actually better option than hospital birth. This research is coming through quite strongly. Do women in Australia know it, given that only 0.3% of women in Australia give birth at home? In other countries it's higher and rising, because in fact in other countries it's being pushed more from the point of view of the medical or the whole maternity system. If only we were in some of those countries, whereas here, of course, home birth is demonized, but sanctum, or some of the birth spaces being designed in other countries, one or two in Australia, not in Melbourne, but in Sydney, they have some of these sanctum birth spaces, or more likely the surveillance room that we know so well, which is set up for that medical emergency, which in its own way then seems to serve that happening. Do women understand the difference that that birth space makes? Do they understand about the need for territorial safety, emotional and psychological safety, or are they educated into also taking on the social norm, the medical norm, that birth will only be safe if we're using this high technology surveillance to supposedly ensure that safety, without knowing that in fact those things then tend to play in the opposite direction? Do women know this? If they don't, who's going to tell them? So childbirth education itself, when we think about it like this, there's some beautiful moves just recently, some research that again came out of really PhD coming out of being supervised by Hannah Darlan, doing so much beautiful work to support all of this dissemination of research, particularly midwifery research. Some of you may be aware of this research. It came out late last year, looking at the complementary therapies for labour and birth study. And you see here can lead to 68% decrease in epidural use. And we know that if we decrease the epidural use, we are definitely going to be decreasing the cesarean rate. You can see here these figures are really spectacular. Some of you, if you're older educators like me, will know that really this research, I sometimes call this research, everything old is new again. Because way back when I started, really what childbirth education was about breathing and relaxation, active birth, massage, visualization, all not so much about acupressure. This is coming through more recently. But most of those things, this was basically what childbirth education used to be about. It's moved into what's often now called just really preparing women for what's going to happen to them in that hospital, so that compliance. So this research is a beautiful bit of research which would encourage all of us to be thinking about childbirth in a different way, to support women in their birthing capacity. And it also in that, so we need to boost these things as well, that research that I've remarked upon, those little bits and pieces of research. There's much more research talking about that really women would be refusing a lot of the standard routine practices if they were looking and they understood the research. This is what childbirth education ideally would be about. So we come now, I'm going to talk now a little bit about this idea of decision making for women and couples, particularly if they were first of all to understand that if they sort of naively go into the hospitals, into the birth culture, pretty much as those comments from the American obstetrician, as many of us know, and what I call circumstantial intervention pathway, which is the circumstances of the particular hospital, that if women go in naively, they're going to be led down that particular pathway, which will lead to those high intervention rates that I've remarked upon already, because that's just what happens in those hospitals. So for women who are coming to understand the science now that's talking about wellness and health of their babies and themselves in terms of the things I've mentioned before, and that they want to optimize their capacity for normal physiological childbirth, they certainly need to be very skilled at decision making and how to go about negotiating between what's on offer as standard in those hospital spaces and negotiating for things to be coming on board in terms of what will really support their birthing capacity. So I want to talk about through some of the points that come into play with regard to decision making. So first of all, this is another thing that's coming really strong now, human rights in lots of things across the world, but in particular, this aspect about human rights in childbirth. Here in Australia, we've got a feisty champion, Bashi Hazard, a lawyer who practices in Sydney, who has taken on the human rights in childbirth here in Australia, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. And I'd suggest as childbirth educators that you should be very familiar with this book, Why Human Rights in Childbirth Matter, and these issues, and really talk about it very clearly with the women and couples in your classes, so that they totally know that that they're on the case in terms of being able to say yes or no. Yes or no, regardless of whether this is what their caregivers are suggesting or not. It is their right. You can read it all here. It's their right to make choices, even if her caregivers do not agree. This is part of the human rights in childbirth. So now that this is starting to be disseminated a little bit, it can cut through some of the fear mongering, I think, that's happening about birth, although it takes quite a feisty woman to trust herself against that onslaught of fear mongering that's happening around birth. But nonetheless, we as childbirth educators need to be reinforcing to them that they do have the right to refuse. So this is one of the big waves of change, I think, that's just hopefully just there on the horizon to come through. Just putting that in sort of context, though, I think obstetric violence now has been named. It's been named, in fact, by an obstetrician herself at the Ranskog World Congress in 2014. And now that it's named, of course, we have to name something to really see it. Or at least when we see it and it doesn't have a name, then we can't grasp it and do something about it. But I think combining the aspect about human rights in childbirth and this understanding about obstetric violence, this is, although it's very painful to reflect on it, it's also very, very helpful in terms of a way forward to understand this. I'm sure as I'm speaking, you're reading that. I'm sure many of you will know that in fact, what's labelled now obstetric violence is what passes for standard care in many, many hospital settings. So do women know this? Do they know it? If they don't, who's going to tell them? Is this a childbirth education issue? I would say it is. Another beautiful bit of research, the woman who has done this, Beck Jenkins and Sue, the two midwives involved, were at the conference, the Passage to Motherhood conference in Brisbane just recently, last week, the week before. The experience of women midwives and obstetricians when women decline recommended maternity care, a feminist thematic analysis. Beautiful bit of research. You can get hold of it. I would recommend it. But I just want to take you through some of the points. This is taken directly from that research paper, so I'm acknowledging that beautiful piece of work. So the research was really looking at the mother's experience, and as I'm speaking, you're looking at this, but if you see in that green, this is part of the themes that related to the woman's journey in terms of her birth and what she was wanting and how she was wanting that birth to unfold. The women talked about that the clinicians that they worked with, whether this was obstetricians or midwives, tended to have sort of a line in the sand, that the caregivers would talk about this idea of yes, yes, you have autonomy, you can make choices, definitely it's up to you, but that what women found was that as the experience went on, most clinicians had a line in the sand where they sort of cut across their idea of honouring the woman's autonomy, where they started to come on much more strongly, and this was then described as escalating intrusion. And you'll see there on the red side of this great diagram that escalating intrusion, which could be coming from midwives and or the obstetric teams, start to be about manipulation, then can move to punishment and judgment, then can be moving to badgering, and then of course can move to assault. And many of us know this is a sample in terms of a research study looking at women's experience of this, but I think it's a great diagram to encapsulate a lot of what we know happens. Do women know this? Of course, many of them know it after their first birth experience, when a third of women come out of their birth experience traumatized or in great distress about what's happened. Often, or not only, I should say, in terms of what's happened physically, medically, but what's happened emotionally for them. And so this is really explaining, and some research which is really quantifying some of those issues that we know. So here's another way that I understand this thing about decision making and how it can be working in that hospital setting. It's around health literacy and physiological match. Oh, actually, I should have their physiological match. I think I've done that wrong. Philosophical match. That should be philosophical match. So health literacy generally, as a culture, community, we're just boosting our knowledge across the board, not only about birthing, but about health literacy generally. It's a slow progress because many of us still are caught in this idea of this trance of acquiescence. Whenever we're dealing with a doctor or a medical situation, be it about birth or anything else in our lives, we often just go in with this trance of acquiescence of feeling like the doctor knows best, or the medical caregiver knows best, and that we just say yes. So I think that still many birthing women are in that trance of acquiescence, even if they're outside the hospital when they're thinking about what they want to do about the birth. They might be feeling, yes, I'm going to do this and do this, but once they get into that hospital space, they can easily fall into this trance of acquiescence. And that, on the other hand, the caregivers who are working with the women, they're assuming that acquiescence. So, in a way, if a woman is caught in that trance of acquiescence and just feels like she should hand it over and say yes, and the caregivers are feeling like, well, the mother will say yes because what I have to say is, the most important or the most powerful or the right thing. So that probably makes for harmony in the birth space. But of course, because of how the birth space is structured, can lead to those high rates of intervention. We then have women who are much more tuned to their own autonomy, attuned, have high levels of health literacy, and know that it's about informed consent or refusal, and that they have that human right and that power for their own autonomy. And there's a growing number of birthing women who carry this view of health literacy and their autonomy into the birth space. And if they are able to meet with caregivers who are working from a women-centered perspective, continuity of care, of course, plays into here as well, and who are working from an evidence-based and an individualized understanding about birth, then that's a harmonious connection as well. So both those two, the upper quadrants, that could be harmonious. Also the bottom two quadrants could be harmonious, but where we really start to see the fireworks happening or the problematic would be if we've got a woman who is coming out of that trance of acquiescence way of working, which is basically giving over responsibility, working with a caregiver who is working from a women-centered, evidence-based, and assuming that the mother will be working from her own autonomy. If that's a connection, that could be problematic and perhaps even dangerous. Just as if we have the caregiver who is assuming acquiescence on the part of the mother, but the mother is strongly imbued with her own autonomy for informed consent or refusal, then that we can see so often ends up in quite a power struggle in that birth space. And regardless of actually how that power struggle unfolds, it usually does damage to how the labour is going to unfold because it changes the hormones. If the mother has to go into fight mode, then that plays out really strongly in terms of what's happening with her hormones and how that birth will unfold anyway. So that can be quite a good way to understand, and a lot of couples who are in my workshops find that very useful for them to understand then how they might go about negotiating that if they're coming up against caregiver or making the choice to the sort of caregivers who will be respecting their autonomy. Decision making, of course, birth intentions or birth plans, of course, everybody has different language about it now. I think more, these are needed now more than ever. So a big question, of course, for childbirth educators or anybody working in the hospital system is, are they encouraged and respected? We know often that they're not. So, but on the other hand, how is a woman going into a birth space that we know has lots of standardized protocols which are going to lead that woman down that cascade of interventions, as I've already suggested, and she's working from the point of view of wanting to protect her birthing capacity, and if she's working in what I call stranger caregiver situations, which are fractured sort of care, not knowing who she's seeing from one day to the next, from 1 hour to the next, from one shift to the next, how is she to really give her intent and her plans and her hopes and dreams about what she wants to happen in that birth, if not through this, the vehicle of the birth intentions, birth plan. There are quite a number of places and spaces for women to work out and to get good information and advice, and I'll have some resources up about that later for women to get hold of the information that would back their choices on their birth intentions. But certainly that question, and as childbirth educators, I would say not just encouraging, but really suggesting that they absolutely must make that birth plan, birth intentions. Decision-making tool, many of you are aware of. This is often more in the context of if in the labour, there are things that are being suggested that the woman, the couple need to be mindful of. This is sort of a little shortened version of how they might conduct one of those conversations. Brain, the way I use it is, of course, the B stands for what are the benefits. So they need to be sold on why they should say yes to whatever's coming their way, what's being suggested. What are all the benefits? What are the risks of doing what's being suggested and or not doing what's suggested? So what are the risks involved in this whole suggested medical procedure or standard protocol? Then they wanted to know, well, what are the alternatives of doing what's suggested? Is there anything else that they could do instead, or nothing? Then we skip to the N, which is, does this have to happen now? So this is trying to get the urgency. And I generally say to couples that, if there are people standing around chewing the fat with them about the pros and cons and this and that and the alternatives, they've certainly got time to take some time, because if it's a very urgent situation, then that's not what's happening. Then the couple will ask for some time and space to reflect on all of that information before they make their decision. They'll then be talking maybe with the midwife, maybe if they have somebody else experienced with them at the birth, and a doula or somebody else, that they might be asking them, are there any alternatives, or what's the thoughts about it? And then for the mother to tune to her intuition about this situation. What's her intuition saying about whether she should say yes or no? I jokingly say, but it's so true that this is a bit of a tough thing, because we have to be able to work out, what's our intuition and what's our fear. This is one of the big rites of passage of mothering, of parenting, is to be able to make that distinction between our fear and our intuition. And I jokingly say it's best that they get that sorted out before they have teenagers on board. So brain, it's used by many educators, and it's a good tool to help couples to negotiate when they're actually in the birth space. But ideally, they've already done a lot of this work beforehand and are in those continuity of models and so on, and their birth plan is being worked out through the pregnancy, so that they're well aware of what these things are, and that then this is less likely to be such a big deal actually when they're in labour. Although when we understand the discrepancy between what women often want and what we know is good for normal physiological childbirth, but what actually is happening in that birth space, then all of these tools can become very important. Here's a few of the resources. I'm not going to go through them all. Some of them are Australian, some of them are from America, some from England, but these are websites that really give lots of information about these things, that for couples who are wanting to sort of work out what should I say yes to, what should I say no to, particularly if they're looking at their birth plan and the conversations, then these are places that they could really tap into to get that sort of information. These are some of the references I've used, and again, I've talked about some of them. I might bring to your attention that last year, the Normal Labour and Birth Conference in Sydney, Dr. Sarah Buckley, if you go onto her website, I think, her website or maybe her Facebook page, but she did a brilliant blog post on that conference, and she's got quite a number of videos of some of the keynote speakers and some of the workshops that are really addressing many of these things that I've talked about. So that would be just a feast for you, or for any women who you feel would really benefit from understanding this in more depth. Yeah, just I think you can see through there that there are aspects that talk about that really back up many of the things that I'm saying. The Roar Behind the Silence, if you don't know this one, this is really a strong and powerful book looking at, we need much more empathetic care in around maternity care, which addresses the issue of obstetric violence. It addresses the thing about human rights. It addresses the aspect about continuity of care, and so on, so on. So, and then there are two there that really relate specifically to childbirth educators, the third and second last. And the Positive Birth book, which has just come out, which of course is a brilliant resource and has great stuff in there about birth plans, but also about women's human rights and their right to refuse what's being suggested by their caregivers. So that there's some great books there to get hold of. Also, if you're not already a friend, if you're not on Facebook, then I think it's important to, as childbirth educators, you know that cohort of pregnant women, generally 25 to 35, they're all living on Facebook, they're all living on social media. If you are not on social media, you are invisible to them. So I would encourage you all to somehow or other get on there, to be making that point, and following Hannah, because she puts up so much of this fantastic research. Encourage the women that you're working with to get onto Hannah's site or mine. I often put things up as well. Or there's another, I think this is a group that women can join, which is called the Natural Hospital Birth Facebook group. Great resources for women who do want to birth in hospital, but they do want to honour their birthing capacity. So there's some great places to get onto in terms of social media. Many, many, many more spaces, but that's a few to get started with if you're not there already. So leaving you with this question of, do women know these things? Do they know? And if they don't know, who should be telling them? Is this part of the role of childbirth education? I think it definitely is. And in fact, you know, that wider education that's being disseminated through social media is another place where they're finding this out, and then they want to have it reinforced by caregivers who have that experience. And childbirth educators are, you know, uniquely placed in that position where they can reinforce the things that we know are beneficial for normal physiological childbirth, which will mean that we're backing women in really making informed choices for their own health and well-being, as opposed to being educators who are teaching and encouraging, you know, that compliance with what is going to happen in that hospital. So I think that's the end of my, just then you might, some of you know about my book, you might like to get hold of that, where I talk about some of these in much more detail, as well as, of course, all the issues about pain that I'm particularly passionate about. I think we're getting close to, like to finish now, and let's have some time for some questions. Good to talk to you. So maybe there's some questions coming through.
Okay, I will maybe. Okay, I'm trying to figure out if we can see you now, or are we still watching your presentation? So we're going to say goodbye now to those who are watching us on Facebook, and we invite you to follow our Capea Vic page and to know when our next webinar will be on. And okay, and now let's go back to just us here and start some questions. And Rhea, there are some comments about thank you, and it was wonderful. And while people are typing their questions, hopefully, and sharing their experience on this topic, I want to ask you the question that was in our survey, and it was actually several times in different language, but it all comes down to birth educators wondering, how do we educate parents on the realities of childbirth and navigating their way without getting them scared to the point of not being able to cooperate where it's needed, or it's just generally not good for birth hormones to be scared in labor. Do you have any?
I do.
Yeah.
It's such a tricky situation, isn't it? Because as I've laid it out, and as we know, women, you know, if they put their trust in that medical institution or system, then maybe that, you know, settles their fears, so that they feel, so that might be useful. But we know that if that's the case, then often they're going to end up with all those interventions anyway because of the routine protocols. At which point then they get fearful, or if they're not fearful in the birth, they come out of the birth and they're distressed and often traumatized. So to not tell them in order to try and protect them is, I think, a you know, of limited service to women who want to be autonomous in their birthing situation, and who are wanting to protect their birthing capacity. So to lay it out in a way where they understand this, maybe sometimes there are softer and gentler places to hear it by getting into some of those research places where they can read it or digest it in a quieter space where they're that they can come to terms with what they're reading rather than maybe a childbirth educator saying it in the moment. Maybe that's one way, but I think that thing of I'm sure that part of that thing of educating for compliance is actually coming from a beautiful warm-heartedness on the part of educators who feel that they don't want to upset women or make them fearful in the way that that question is asked. So my take on that is I don't think it serves them well in the long term because of what we know in terms of the outcomes. So you could probably do it a little more gently. I'm sure there are people who can do this much more gently than I do. I'm getting to be too old and too feisty and too distressed by what's happening, and I'm a grandmother now, and I'm looking more close, further into the future, and becoming more and more passionate and distressed and angry. So I'm saying it pretty forcefully. Hopefully somebody can then take that message and soften it off a little bit. So perhaps I don't really have a good answer to that particular question.
Okay, and Abby is asking another question. That's the second question that comes to mind, because some women are just not interested in hearing about normal birth. How do you teach these things in a class where some women really want to believe their obstetrician is going to take care of them? How do we deal with the resistance?
I mean, really, we're not going to win all the situation. It has become a situation where women can make social choices about what they can say yes or no. So some women don't want to know about normal birth, and they're quite happy to make the choices that are being suggested to them by their obstetrician or in that hospital and to go ahead with that. So I don't see those women and I don't work with them. If for any of you who are working with them, you're not going to change their mind. But that I don't think is the whole body of the women that you're working with. And so if you only make your childbirth education about dealing with those women, then you're missing the opportunity of really engaging with these issues with that broader spectrum of women who actually, if they really understood it or understood more about how they could make those choices, would make the choice towards more aspects that would support their birthing capacity. In the meantime, those of us who are passionate about this need to do all that work to keep shaping and changing the birth culture so that it was more user-friendly to women to support their birthing capacity. But I think the women who are not interested in normal physiological childbirth, not much you're going to be able to do about them at this point. And so I wouldn't really be, I'm just saying it quite black and white here, but I wouldn't be wasting too much energy on them because they are very well served in the birth culture. They don't need to know too much more about it because it's all on hand for them. They don't have to have a normal physiological childbirth. They can have any and all of those interventions. It's much easier for them to access those interventions than it is for women who have some yearning towards their own bodily autonomy and capacity for birthing.
Thank you. And yes, it can be quite different for those of us who work independently and for those of us who are working in hospitals and who just get people. And Joe here writes, thank you, Rhea. It was lovely to hear you speak. I just wanted to share a recent experience in a birthing class in which a woman said, I'm getting the feeling you don't want us to have an epidural. It really made me think about the whole compliance thing.
Well, I mean, if we know the link with epidurals to a whole cascade of interventions. I mean, any of you have been following me and know that I now talk about the Trojan horse in the birth space. We thought it was a great gift, and I think many women think it's a great gift, but in fact, with what it means in terms of that cascade and the pathway down to the Caesars and what have you, that it's not the gift that it seems to be. And there's also research coming out saying that for women who have epidurals, it doesn't necessarily mean that they come out of the birth feeling better about the birth. In fact, they might, in the moments of the birth when they're pain-free, enjoy that, and of course, who wouldn't? But in terms of their emotional and psychological health after the birth, no. Just because they've been pain-free in the birth does not equate with them feeling good about the birth experience. So I think that research should give us heart, those of us who are working with women and wanting them to give them this education, would encourage them to be working with pain, getting those working with pain skills and that capacity of people around them to help to support them with that. Even the obstetricians and gynecologists from America are saying that they've specifically labelled epidurals, that really if women can avoid epidurals, much better outcomes. So if they're saying it, the rest of us, of course, should be jumping on board with that.
Mm-hmm. Joe is asking, if model of care is already chosen, how do we as educators inform at 28 weeks or later when we first meet them?
Yes, this is such a big issue, isn't it? So some of this you can see requires sort of public education, not childbirth education in the way that it's designed, which is that it generally happens quite late in the pregnancy when much of the pathway is often set. Although many of us do also have that experience of women changing their options quite late in the piece once they get an understanding of this. And of course, many of them change their options with their second baby after they've had a birth that's been less than, less than what they had hoped it would be. But how do we get with those women having their first births before it's sort of set, their pathway is set? So I think that's public education. It's also about midwives themselves, when they first meet those women in early pregnancy. So that's probably more one-on-one education rather than childbirth education. It's about hospitals themselves starting to put out information. I mean, if any of you have looked at the national, so in England, the National Health, what's it called, the NHS, their website is unbelievable in comparison to what we have here in Australia, because they, first of all, front and center when they're giving a whole lot of options, they say your choices in birth. Home birth is the, you can choose home birth, you can choose birth center birth, you can choose a hospital birth. You can choose this, you can choose that. There's lots and lots of brilliant education that is around supporting normal physiological childbirth, which would be the sort of go-to portal for anyone, I imagine, in England who's pregnant, that they know about the National Health Service. They have this standardized sort of website that gives all that information, and then they could search that out in their own local areas. So wouldn't that be wonderful if we had something like that was so clearly framed to talk about what these options are and what the consequences of the choices are. But in our culture, I think it falls to those midwives who are first meeting, and of course it would also be GPs, if we could educate GPs around this, because that's often the first place that women when they're pregnant will go to, and so many of them are uninformed, misinformed about all of these options. So for any of you who feel passionate about this and who feel you want to get into sort of public education as opposed to childbirth education that's relating to just couples later in their pregnancy, there's lots you can do, lots you can do.
Mm-hmm. And Linda wrote us about models of care. She wrote, "Hi there, thanks for the great presentation. I just want to point out that MGP programs offered in hospital offer more continuity than the normal care, but it's still quite different to continuity with a non-caregiver."
Yeah. I know there's even the things that we think are sort of a step along that golden highway that we would like women to be moving along when they're pregnant. They're not necessarily so straightforwardly what we would hope and think that they might ideally be, but certainly better than fractured stranger caregiver, which is really the sort of standard way that women receive care in our birth culture. So any and all of those innovations really deserve to be really, and the midwives who work in them, I honour them because they're, you know, it's something, it's a taste of something that can make a difference.
Mhm. And Guy is asking, what was the name of the lawyer working towards making obstetric violence more visible? The name of the lawyer that you mentioned?
Hashi Bazard, Hashi. Bash. I've got a piece of paper here. Okay, ask me something else and I'll find it.
Okay. The next question is, do you ever suggest that women ask for protocols from their caregivers?
Hold that question because I've found it. So it's Bashi, Bashi, Hazard, Hazard. I'm sure if you Google her, you will find her. And she is hotshot in terms of supporting women's human rights in childbirth. She tells us that if there's a problem, you know, get on to me, and I will get on to the obstetrician and ask and explain to them about human rights in childbirth. And so she's a great person to have in your little arsenal of support and care. Going back to that question again, the one that you were asking.
Do you ever suggest that women ask for protocols from their caregivers?
I do suggest that they do all of those things, and of course, depending on how their caregiver responds to that, gives them lots and lots of information. Because if the caregivers respond in a patronizing or defensive way, then that tells them something. If, on the other hand, the caregiver, you know, is very generous and talks through what the protocols are and that they can have that conversation, of course, we know sometimes that that can be done in a way that makes women feel safe and trusting in the pregnancy, only to find come the birth that sometimes it's not followed through within the same spirit. But certainly the more they can, if they've got somebody who is talking about those things during the pregnancy, then hopefully, and not putting them off or saying, well, let's wait and see or what have you, that would be better than not. When they've got women in this birth culture that is so stacked against normal physiological childbirth, for women who really still have some yearning and want to honour their health and their well-being and the health and well-being of their babies, they have got to be proactive about all of these things. Maybe just to say one thing there, you know, they can't sit back and wait. I've been talking with some of the midwifery academics and researchers, as well as some research came out of America where they said that in health policy, it can take up to 17 years before protocols change from the point of view of research coming down through that hospital to start to become, you know, standard care. 17 years, that's a whole other generation. Some of the midwifery academics that I speak to say that really if there was concerted sort of education and action by women in terms of them fighting for their human rights and demanding their human rights and informed right, you know, informed consent and refusal, they think that maybe some of these changes that are so, the research that's saying that most of the standard protocols are not necessary and actually are detrimental, that they're more hopeful, thinking maybe it could be 5 to 7 years. So maybe that's a difference between a woman having 1 or 2 of her babies. It's still a long time. So if we want to close that gap between that research that says that she should refuse, you know, continuous monitoring, not have epidurals or what have you, all of those things, then there's lots of public education, there's lots of passionate activists who need to be working, there's lots of women who need to be backed by some of the social media that supports understanding these things if we want to speed up that process. Because if women can be demanding it, which of course was the big move in the 70s when I was involved in early in my work, to really push some of those changes because of the action of women and their partners. So we want to galvanise their capacity, but it shouldn't all be left to the women to have to fight that system in the midst of their labours. So there's lots of work for the rest of us who are passionate, whether we're childbirth educators, we're independent or in hospitals, or any of us in this work. It's important and urgent.
Thank you. Time flies, really. It's a bit over an hour now. If somebody has some last question, maybe you still have a chance to ask it. And this was our first webinar, and we hope to continue doing this during this year. And if you're a Capea member, you will be receiving invitation further. And if you're not Capea member yet, maybe you want to become one. This year is starting membership year. So if there's no more questions, maybe there is one last thing you want to tell childbirth educators to continue working.
I just felt I want to read a poem that I wrote, and it relates, because I'm a grandmother now, and I mentioned this before, and lots of you might know this anyway, but since I've become a grandmother, I've become even more passionate about these things because I'm looking further into the future. And I wrote this poem in 2015 that I think was a good spot to finish on. It's a bit of a riff on another poem written by Drew Dillinger, who some of you might know his poem Hieroglyphic Highway. I won't read it, but just to say, you'll get the flavour of his when I read this one. So I say, Drew, I too am awakened at 3:23 in the morning because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. They implore me in my dreams. What did you do while our instinctive birthing legacy was plundered? What did you do when the biological, hormonal foundation of human loving connection was unraveling? Surely you did something when women's bodies started failing as physiological birth, bonding, and breastfeeding were dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when women's birthing and breastfeeding power was stolen? What did you do once you knew? I think that's a place to finish.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
Good. Thank you for organising. Bye, everyone.